The CPU market is a total mess right now, which makes choosing the right CPU for your next gaming PC build tricky at best, and understanding the current CPU landscape nearly impossible. With Ryzen 9000 CPU reviews now out, and some calling the CPUs both fantastically efficient and also a terrible upgrade over last gen, rumours circling of more new Ryzen X3D chips in just a matter of weeks, and Intel's 13th and 14th gen in turmoil, what on earth is going on? And today I'm going to explain it. Is now a terrible time to buy a CPU? Are there any good chips left? Let's dive into it, because this could get a little bit complicated. Supercharge your gaming experience with Zotac's RTX 40 series GPUs. Powered by the ultra-efficient Ada Lovelace architecture, with support for NVIDIA DLSS 3.5 and of course full ray tracing, what's not to love? Zotac's range features their Ice Storm 2.0 advanced cooling technology and Spectra RGB lighting, which you can customize in software. A metal backplate, high build quality, and 3+2 year warranty that extends to 5 years total with registration, gives you peace of mind now and into the future. Check them out at the first links in the description below. The aim of this video is to try and explain the incredibly complicated state of play in the CPU market and make it as simple as possible. So let's start off with the fundamentals. Now, the desktop CPU market is one of the biggest duopolies in the world, and despite attempts from other brands, most recently Snapdragon, who seem to be making some good progress, AMD and Intel are really the only major players in the desktop space. AMD, as it stands, have Ryzen 5000, 7000, and 9000 available for sale, while Intel have their 14th gen and last generation 13th gen CPUs. You can also find some 12th gen chips still on the market if you try hard enough. Now, AMD's Ryzen 5000 lineup was the last generation to use the AM4 socket. This is where the pins were based on the CPU and to support the older DDR4 memory. AMD's Ryzen 7000 and brand new Ryzen 9000 CPUs use the new AM5 socket, and like Intel CPUs, move all the pins onto the motherboard and off the CPU itself. AMD's Ryzen 7 and 9000 both support DDR5 memory exclusively and are on a platform which AMD are saying they're going to leverage for years to come to release even Ryzen 10,000 CPUs and potentially beyond. Intel, on the other hand, is a bit more of a complicated scenario. A few years back, they launched their 12th gen lineup of CPUs, which went down pretty well, and a year or so later, they improved the performance of these, as Intel often do, with 13th gen. What happened with 14th gen was unusual though. Normally, Intel changed CPU and major architectures every 2 generations. But for 14th gen, they decided, no, we're going to make the generation last that little bit longer and build on what was already a successful line of CPUs, 14 Blue. The 12th, 13th, and 14th gen processors all leverage the same socket and support both DDR4 and DDR5 memory depending on the motherboard. It's no secret that Intel 15th gen chips are expected later this year, at least that's what all the credible rumours and lifecycle patterns seem to suggest, and that they will use a new CPU socket. So these Intel chips are sort of at the end of their lifespan, especially for those of you looking to buy a chip with good upgrade prospects. Now, Ryzen 7000 was a very, very strong set of processors, and while Ryzen 5000 that preceded it was pretty good, 7000 brought AMD well and truly into the next generation. Now, Ryzen 7000 wasn't without its challenges. Initially, the motherboards offered for sale were incredibly expensive, and DDR5 memory, which has now dropped significantly in price, was pricey and didn't perform that well, with high latencies and a lack of high-speed options available, especially comparative to the pricing and performance of Intel's DDR4 supporting counterparts. Luckily for AMD though, as time passed on, things improved drastically. You can now find AMD's AM5 motherboards for less than their Intel counterparts, while DDR5 memory is now close to the price DDR4 was just a few years ago. Intel have too confirmed that their 15th gen Arrow Lake CPUs will be DDR5 exclusively, so you can wave goodbye to that older DDR4 memory standard. Now, Ryzen 7000 was strong and punched well against the Intel 12th and 13th gen. Obviously, 14th gen was designed to throw a bit of a hammer blow to Team Red, but if you cast your mind back to when those chips first landed and the reviews from lots of press and media such as ourselves, you know that wasn't quite the case. The real winner for AMD though came with this, their X3D lineup of processors, signified by this cool orange accenting on the box. Now, if you don't know, a CPU has a few key characteristics. Simply put, these are the core count, thread count, the base and boost clock speeds, and the cache. Now, the number of cores determines the number of things a CPU can do at once. For gaming, you only really need about 6 to 8 great. Anything more than this is going to be particularly useful for video editing and rendering and productivity tasks, but not particularly help your frame rate in Fortnite or Warzone. The big constraining factor in lots of these gaming CPUs, especially now that clock speed has increased and we're frequently passing the 5 GHz barrier, is actually the cache. And that is where AMD's X3D chips really pulled ahead. These actually feature AMD's stacked cache technology. That's where they stack the L3 cache on top of each other and give you far more of it on the CPU, allowing the CPU to store far more data and far more instructions closer than in the memory. And when I say closer, we're talking about quicker access, lower latencies, and overall more performance through higher efficiency. So this is all sounding good. Ryzen 7000, we like it. 7000 X3D, particularly fantastic, especially for gaming, and also super price competitive. Intel, a little bit more complicated, but things in the last few weeks and months have, well, taken what was a fairly understandable situation and made it that bit more confusing. Now, you remember earlier I said that these Intel 13th and 14th gen chips already run hot and are quite power hungry. Well, to compound these issues, which had already led users to install far more beefy 420mm AIOs on their CPUs than ever before, there were reports circling that Intel chips, predominantly those in the i7 and i9 ranges, though this technically affects any CPU with a TDP higher than 65 watts, had potential issues around running at an elevated voltage, this causing crashing, instability, and of course even higher temperatures. Now, Intel have very recently announced a fix for this, and we have seen beta BIOSes land with the likes of MSI and Asus, but it's too early to tell yet whether this really solves the problem and how many chips out there could be affected. Compound that with the natural downside that Intel chips on the 13th and 14th gen lineup are on a platform that is fastly approaching the end of its life, and it makes Intel chips hard to recommend. Ryzen 9000 then came in and seemingly was going to give AMD a slam dunk opportunity to sail even further ahead of their Intel counterparts. Now, Ryzen 9000 has done a lot well, and that might feel like a controversial thing to hear against a backdrop of predominantly negative reviews. Now, what Ryzen 9000 has done well, and it's an area that in the past particularly on both CPUs and GPUs that AMD has been criticized for, is efficiency. They've managed to reduce the power consumption and thus the operating temperatures of all of the Ryzen 9000 chips we've seen released so far when compared to their Ryzen 7000 counterparts. This increase in efficiency is only a good thing for the platform, for power consumption, and for AMD, who, let's face it, are probably going to pump out higher clock speed versions of these chips and X3D iterations in the months and years that follow. Now, while fundamentally better efficiency is a good thing, for gamers who just want more performance, it doesn't necessarily answer that question and that need. And let's be clear, am I suggesting that you should go out and spend $70 or $80 more for a like-for-like chip that performs pretty much identically because it consumes 18 less watts under an all-core load? No. Take the Ryzen 7 9700X and compare it to the price of the Ryzen 7 7700X. Do the same thing for the Ryzen 5 7600X and compare it to the newer Ryzen 5 9600X. Would you like to pay $60, $70, $80 more for a more efficient CPU that provides no more performance? Hands up? Anyone? No one? No, I didn't think so. So what on earth should you actually do? That's why you came to this video. Well, my initial reaction on the Intel side would be to simply avoid, at least for now. As the weeks develop, we could see this microcode update that's going out through motherboard BIOS solve the problem, which leaves us with AMD Ryzen. What would my advice be there? Now, while I don't like, to be clear, that AMD have released new CPUs with no more performance at a higher price, AMD do this all the time. Let's pause on CPUs for a minute and look at graphics cards, and just bear with me here. Radeon RX 7900 XTX. How much did it retail for when it launched? $999. How much can you buy one for now? Just a shave over $900. The RX 7900 XT, how much did that launch for? $899. How much can you buy one for now? $699. And it's the same with CPUs. To be fair, I don't think AMD are trying to price gouge the market with their new chips, but they always seem to launch stuff at a price that they never really commit to holding for more than, well, a couple of months. Let's face it, the Ryzen 5 7600X, which you can now find for around $200, didn't launch for that when it first came out. In fact, I seem to remember it being around the $300 mark, and that fell extraordinarily quickly. And Ryzen 9000 will do the same, and that changes the question and changes the argument. Should you buy a more efficient CPU with nominally more performance for what could be the same price as the Ryzen 7000 chips once they fall? The answer, of course, is yes. Now, to be clear, that is not a criticism on anybody who said don't buy Ryzen 9000, because in the current landscape and in the current pricing, it doesn't make sense. But AMD won't hold these prices for long. So what then should you do? Well, if you're shopping at the high end, I would wait. See what happens with the X3D chips that are strongly rumoured to be launching very soon. If you're building a more mid-range or even entry-level gaming PC, I would actually say that now's a great time to buy. Ryzen 5 7000 is cheaper than ever, and the fact that the new Ryzen 9000 chips are no major improvement means you're not losing out by buying last gen. At least normally when you buy last generation, it means a compromise, it means you're losing some performance or losing some features. You're losing nothing. No performance, no features, same motherboard chipsets, it's all square. Maybe the current landscape with Intel has delayed 15th gen, and I'm sure they'll be keen not to get it wrong, as has happened with 14th generation. But also, let's be clear, I can imagine Intel are probably quite keen to move on from the woes of 13th and 14th generation. Hopefully this helped. What do you guys think of the current CPU landscape? Let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.